Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Environmental Justice Now. My name is Leah Jones, and I am the Education Coordinator at Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. Thanks for returning for another episode this week. Today's episode, we are discussing more about the Build Back Better plan and the ways in which it could impact diverse communities across the state. So, if you haven't tuned into some of our previous episodes discussing the Build Back Better plan, here's a little bit more about it. The Build Back Better plan is a set of $3.5 trillion infrastructure priorities to achieve the goal of cutting U.S. greenhouse gas emissions at least in half by the year 2030. Build Back Better proposes focused investments in things like clean electricity payment program, a clean energy standard, clean energy and vehicle tax credits, climate smart agriculture, civilian conservation corps, wildfire prevention, federal procurement of clean technologies, the weatherization and electrification of buildings, clean energy accelerators, methane reduction, and polluter import fees. Just to name a few, definitely a long list, right? So another important portion of this plan that we've been advocating for is the Justice 40 initiative. It carves out 40% of federal energy and environmental spending to specifically support disadvantaged communities. And it's really important because this is the first targeted investment to address frontline environmental justice communities hardest hit by environmental harms, economic disinvestment, and climate change. It invests in rural communities and communities impacted by the market based transition to clean energy. This includes funding to address climate change, energy, transportation, housing, workforce training, pollution cleanup, and water infrastructure programs. So, needless to say, these investments into EJ communities could be life changing for Virginians across the state. So, to continue this conversation and discussing the ways in which Build Back Better could impact rural communities, I have the pleasure of being in conversation today with another member of the VAIPL team, Phyllis Cox, our new chapter coordinator. This is her first appearance on our Environmental Justice Now show today, and we are so excited to welcome her for this discussion. Hi, Phyllis. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Leah. It's really good to be on the show and to be part of the team at VAIPL.
Great. It's awesome to have you here. So, before we get started today, I'd like to do a quick lane acknowledgement. While we are all on a video call and many of us are joining from different places, we want to remind ourselves that we gather on the unceded land of the indigenous peoples. I am joining in from the so called Richmond, Virginia area, and I am currently located on the land of the Powhatan and Chickahominy peoples. If you are unsure whose land you are on and want to find out, you can always visit native-land.ca to find out. So now let's dive into the conversation. So just to start, especially since this is your first time on the show today, Phyllis, could you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and your interest in Build Back Better in rural communities?
Sure. I am the latest member of the VAIPL team, and I work pretty exclusively with the Roanoke Area Interfaith Stewards of the Earth, as well as with the group in Richmond. And RAISE, or the Roanoke Area Interfaith Stewards of the Earth, started about a year and a half ago, and they have environmental justice as the core of their movement, and they are very on the ground, grassroots, and I'm excited to be working with them. I have a bachelor's in environmental studies and also my master's degree in Christian ministry. So I bring an interesting faith lens to working with environmental justice and see it as simply taking care of our neighbors as ourselves, the way we are instructed by the Holy Scriptures.
That's awesome, Phyllis. And once again, it has been great having you there to kind of be a person to really also continue the work in all areas of Virginia, especially because you do live in a rural area, which is a part of the reason why it's so great to have you on this conversation today. So now I would just like to ask a little bit more about how you feel Build Back Better could affect rural communities or how it could even impact your own rural community.
Well, my husband and I live in a rural part of Augusta County, and we live on a little around 2 acres, and we are about 2.5 miles from the main road, Route 11, and found out soon after we moved there that not only did we not have cable, but the good things that we lost were paying a lot of taxes living in the city of Stanton, but the bad things were the infrastructure is kind of missing. So we don't have access except through our telephone to internet, and it's definitely not broadband and it's not fast. So I look forward personally to the advantages of possibly getting broadband in our area. I know other areas of Virginia have already gotten broadband access, and we look forward to that. But also just the investment in things like access to transportation. We're still 2.5 miles from the closest access point to public transportation. 2.5 miles uphill, may I add to
Oh,
that.
uphill. Imagine walking
Uphill.
that. Yes.
So it's not like it's just down the block. It's not easy to access public transportation. So I look at the infrastructure part of it, the investment in finally the investment in infrastructure would be wonderful. The uh, Additionally, just the incentives for energy. My husband and I have talked several times about adding solar panels to our roof so that we could reduce our energy load on the electrical system. And if we had an incentive to that, we certainly would invest in that to help lighten our carbon footprint.
Absolutely. And I love the pieces that you said about transportation because that's a very real issue for folks living in rural areas. Because also, a lot of the times we know that people who live in rural areas don't necessarily work in the same rural areas. They
Right.
need transportation to get to their job. And in many cases, we see that being a really frustrating. A really frustrating part of living in a rural area. So real investments in that could really help make people's lives way easier, right, on a day-to-day basis. Being
Absolutely.
able to go out and not walk 2.5 miles uphill to get to a place of public transportation where they know they can make it to their job on time, reliably so. So
Right.
investments like that are so crucial. Not to mention investments in water infrastructure as well in rural areas, which kind of brings me to the next question that I wanted to ask, which is why you feel like it's so important to specifically address the ways in which this infrastructure plan could affect rural communities throughout the state. I know you feel passionately about us bringing rural communities into the conversation because oftentimes we see that they don't necessarily get the light shed on them when these opportunities do come up to invest and rebuild. A lot of times we can see rural communities getting left behind. So, why do you feel like it is so important to address these issues specifically about rural communities?
Well, I think too often the money gets funneled to the large metropolitan areas like the capital to and Northern Virginia and Tidewater. And those are important areas and they are more populous areas. But there's a lot of Virginia that is past Richmond, even past Charlottesville and the Blue Ridge Mountains. And those people also have the same issues. They have the same infrastructure issues. They have the same problems with their water supplies. They have polluted water from old coal plants that have been shut down and old mining, salt mining, and other chemicals that have been used for fracking and that kind of stuff in the water. So a lot of times their water is not safe for them to drink, but they don't know it because the programs stop with the major metropolitan areas. And this Build Back Better seems to me that it will offer those people the opportunity to have their water tested and to possibly get into the infrastructure replacement that is so necessary for those areas to grow and flourish. After all, if we start having flooding on the coastline, those people will be moving inland and those problems will follow them inland. And it's important for us to build that infrastructure now.
Absolutely. And I think that the Build Back Better plan also presents, like, a really feasible opportunity maybe to really kind of reinvent these economies in rural areas who have previously, like you mentioned, been in area dominated by or economically stimulated by the coal mining industries in general, fracking, pipelines. The Build Back Better infrastructure plan, especially when we throw in Justice 40, presents a real opportunity for EJ communities or rural communities, like we've just described, who may have been left behind to really kind of reinvent and thrive and flourish, as you said. So, yeah, I definitely think rural communities having their support on this plan is so important. And for all the reasons that we've just mentioned already, but also it is so crucial to bring rural communities into this conversation because they actually do a lot for the state.
Absolutely.
Do tons for the state, even economically. When we think about agriculture or the previous fields that we mentioned before, like mining or fracking, energy. These are all really big sources of income for the state of Virginia. So we have to make sure that we are keeping our neighbors in rural communities in mind as we move towards a cleaner economy and move towards trying to restructure the way I guess our state, our country operates and sees and understands infrastructure. So absolutely, I love everything that you stated about that. And I know you feel so passionately
I
about
do.
about rural communities not being left behind and Virginia not stopping at Charlottesville or Richmond, especially, because it's so easy to forget for those of us here in the metropolitan area. Things can be busy, so
Yeah, we're
um,
not West Virginia. We're
no,
Virginia.
and we're not West Virginia. Rural communities are not West Virginia. Those past Charlottesville are not West Virginia. So it's important that we keep that in mind and do the necessary outreach to these communities, like we mentioned, who may not even know that their water quality may be bad or things of that nature. So when we start now talking about building support, especially in rural communities, what do you feel like are some actions that people can take to really show their support for this Build Back Better plan? Is there anything specific that to rural communities that folks should be taking action on? What do you think, Phyllis?
I specifically think that people are put off by the idea of contacting their representation in both the General Assembly and in Congress. And really and truly, those people are paid by our money, and they need to remember that they are there to serve us, not us to serve them. So we really need to contact them and hold their feet to the fire to get this passed through Congress and to make sure that the monies come to the states and to the communities where they're needed, not just the metropolitan areas. And I think one of the most effective ways that you can do that is not just call, which is a wonderful thing, but if you have access to a computer, email your representation. Also, you can simply sit down and write them a letter. And we have sample letters on our website that show you how to contact your representation and to be involved with it, because they're not going to read your mind and they're not going to know what you're thinking unless you tell them. And I have reached out to my representation on a number of occasions, and I always get a response because they know who put them into office.
Definitely, definitely. And I think you mentioned a great idea yesterday, Phyllis, when we were chatting about some people you've heard in your own community, maybe who their congregation has set aside time for everyone to get together. Even now, because it's still summer, we can socially distance and safely get together and write letters to our representatives so we can have
Absolutely.
fellowship and action at the same time.
Hmm.
There are awesome creative ways to uh, spread the word, get people excited, make it a group effort, and make a real impact in your community, and really start the buzz in your legislators' ears. So every
Absolutely.
effort is not for naught. It's so important to uh, use your voice and use your own people power. So thanks so much, Phyllis, for everything that you've had to offer this discussion, and just for sharing your personal experience and letting the people who tune into environmental justice now get to know you a bit better. So I think we're closing out the show. Do you have any last thoughts, Phyllis, before we close out?
Well, I hope that you will invite me back for another environmental justice show. And I hope that we can keep raise in the forefront of our mind when we're thinking about Roanoke, because they have some great initiatives. They're going to be working at the recycling center on the 21st. They will be talking to people that come to leave their recyclables and trying to drum up support for Build Better, excuse me, Build, what is it?
Back better.
Build Back Better.
Brain fart.
Senior moment.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Phyllis. Sounds
You're
great.
welcome.
All right. And be sure to tune in to next week's episode. And if you would like to keep up with what VAIPL is doing, with what Raise is doing, please be sure to join our e-news and our mailing list at the link going across the ticker below. And we'll see you next week. Bye,
All
everyone.
right. Bye.